Hello, welcome, workers and friends, and welcome back to Working Class Revolt. I'm your host, Dust James, the Marxist-Leninist truck driver. I'm coming to you live from my humble home in rural North Carolina. And as always, I'm joined with my great co-host, the Thunder from Down Under, union organizer, David Fox. How are things in Australia?
Oh, I'm very good, thank you. It's just into the afternoon, so it won't be a good morning. It's a good afternoon. Freezing cold, wet outside at the moment.
It's actually quite lovely here. I took my son out to the park early this evening. It gets dark early, but it's kind of that perfect fall temperature. So we're continuing our study of the Foundations. I got the lights too bright. The Foundations of Leninism by J.V. Stalin. If you haven't, you can go back and watch our previous readings and discussions. Now we're on Theory, Chapter 3, and we are joined by two lovely, confident guests that will hopefully provide much insight. We have a returning guest with us, which I lovingly call Ozzy. That's the best I can get to saying his name. He's joining us live from New Zealand, or I believe there's another name that you call it. How are things going? And what do you prefer to call your country?
It's not my country. It's somebody else's.
Okay.
Country. I'm just living here. Forgive my pronunciation, comrades, but it's Aotearoa, or Land of the Long White Cloud. So,
right on.
Very similar story to everywhere else that's colonial. You know, white people showed up, lied about treaties, took over, and killed a lot of people. Not as bad as in the rest of the West, but yeah, very much the same old story.
Very insightful. Thank you, comrade. So we also have first-time guest on the show. I believe I appeared on his show recently. You can check that out. Check out his channel. Just go on the YouTube and find Connor Gillis. Check out her channel, Connor Gillis. I was on there for Commies in the Country, I believe it was. Please subscribe. Yeah, Go ahead, man. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for the introduction. I am very excited to be here, just coming at you from the great state of Texas. Just trying to survive. Today, during the daytime, it was Shabbat. You know, I'm Jewish, so just enjoying a nice, relaxing day off. And now that the sun's down, it's back to work.
Right on. So I guess we'll get right into it. Before we start to... we're going to be reading quite a long portion aloud. Hopefully everyone's up for that. We're going to be reading the material aloud. Before we go into that, let's do some kind of introductory remarks. If I can just kind of do a recap. So we already went through, the intro. We did the historic roots of Leninism. We studied method with Jay. And now we're going into theory. And, theory sounds like, it's going to be something complicated or hard to read, but it's not. And I love the way Stalin, breaks things down. So working folks, you don't need a degree to be able to understand the material. And that's one of the things I love about Stalin. And everyone will tell you horrible things about Stalin. And a lot of it has to do with his effectiveness, not only as a politician, but also as a theorist and as materialist. Maybe if we want to do a round of initial responses or background, we'll start off with David Fox. Any background on the piece you want to say before we get started?
Interestingly, this book is actually one of probably the most legendary Marxist material around. I came across his works on historical and dialectical materialism. It was a fantastic read. It basically, with a lot of texts I read around a lot of particular subject matters, it can be really quite academic and complicated. Big reads and it takes some time, but this is more straight to the point type stuff. And I think that's that's the key to actually when we're addressing common working people, common masses. It's got to be straight to the point. It's got to be simple. It's got to be in their language. And the only other person not the only person, that's incorrect, but one other major significant figure in human history was Mao. He wrote very similar to Stalin wrote too. If you actually look at the work, sometimes you think, who was that? Mao? Was that Mao? Wrote that? But that's what it was. It was actually directed towards the people, who were struggling. And what I found in my experience, if you make it all too complicated and technical and long and lengthy, it just goes straight over people's heads, especially for all of us here that work one way or the other. You could be doing 12-hour shifts, long work days and everything else. At the end of the day, if it's a particularly long, heavy day of work, the last thing you want to be reading is a very thick document full of high literature. So this is what was a really good designer. And actually, I was meant to mention the other day as well, this is good organising material as well. So you can actually use it. It's very practical material that can actually help us organise around as well, or help us in our organising efforts.
All right, thank you, Comrade Fox. Let's go on to Comrade Ozzy. Any notes before we begin?
Yeah, just one of the things I noticed about it, right in the very first line, and we're going to hear this very shortly. Without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. And I think that's true. And it's not just true, it's very obviously true. Even when you see things like, I don't know, online dramas or whatever, you can tell that without the theory to give anybody some kind of guidance as to where we're going and why, it's too easy to get distracted and diverted with things that seem important but really aren't. And so that's my take on it.
Right on.
In addition to everything Dave's already said. So.
Right on. On to Connor. Any notes before we begin?
Yeah, just sort of building off what David said. Stalin was sort of that first leader of the socialist movement that was that connection between the masses and the party. Before that, you had people like Marx and Engels and Lenin, who were geniuses, and Lenin even more so as a hero and a revolutionary, but they didn't come from that same working class or peasant background, and Stalin was that first person who was a member of the high-ranking member of the party and a very intelligent man who could speak very plainly and simply about very complex topics to people. And I don't know where I heard this, but if you can't explain it to a 5-year-old, then you don't fully understand it yourself. I don't know how true that is, but Stalin certainly had a knack for being able to simplify things that took Marx and Engels an entire capital to write. And I think one of the best examples is Dialectical and Historical Materialism. The comparison between its explanation of dialectical and historical materialism and digging into a work like Capital and trying to get dialectical and historical materialism out of that. And I think it's very clear the difference in what type of writer Stalin was. And I think it's important to study him.
Right on. So we're just going to get into reading the material. We have quite a lot to go over. Don't worry about pronunciation of words. Do the best that you can and just try to keep it moving. And try to, let's get a rotation so we don't have any pauses. I'll start and then we'll go on the camera at Fox and then Jones and then Gillis. Okay, here we go. J.V. Stalin, Foundations of Leninism, Chapter 3, Theory. From this theme, I take 3 questions. A, the importance of theory for the proletarian movement. B, criticism of theory of spontaneity. C, the theory of the proletarian revolution. Comrade Fox?
1, the importance of theory. Some think that Leninism is the precedence of practice over theory in the sense that its main point is the translation of Marxian thesis into deeds. Their execution as for theory, it is alleged that Leninism is rather unconcerned about it. We know that Plekhanov occasionally chaffed Lenin about his unconcern for theory, and particularly for philosophy. We also know that theory is not held in great favour by many present-day Leninist practical workers, particularly in view of the overwhelming amount of practical work imposed upon them by present circumstances. I must declare that this more than odd opinion about Lenin and Leninism is quite wrong, and bears no relation whatever to the truth, that the attempt of practical workers to brush theory aside runs counter to the whole spirit of Leninism and is fraught with serious dangers to the cause. Did you want me to continue, or do we just do a paragraph at a time?
Comrade Ozzy?
Sure.
Yep.
Theory is the experience of the working class movement in all countries, taken in its general aspect. Of course, theory becomes purposeless if it is not connected with revolutionary practice, just as practice gropes in the dark if its path is not illuminated by revolutionary theory. But theory can become a tremendous force in the working class movement if it is built up in indissoluble connection with revolutionary practice. For theory, and theory alone, can give the movement confidence, the power of orientation, and an understanding of the inner relation of surrounding events. For it, and it alone, can help practice to realize not only how and in which direction classes are moving at the present time, but also how and in which direction they will move in the near future. None other than Lenin uttered and repeated scores of times the well-known thesis that, without a revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement.
Lenin, better than anyone else, understood the great importance of theory, particularly for a party such as ours. And in view of a vanguard fighter of the international proletariat, which has fallen to its lot, and in view of the complicated internal and international situation in which it finds itself. Foreseeing this special role of our party as far back as 1902, he thought it necessary even then to point out that the role of the vanguard fighter can be fulfilled only by a party that is guided by the most advanced theory.
It scarcely needs proof that now, when Lenin's prediction about the role of our party has come true, this thesis of Lenin's acquires special force and special importance.
Perhaps the most striking expression of the great importance which Lenin attached to theory is the fact that none other than Lenin undertook the very serious task of generalizing, in line with the materialist philosophy, the most important achievements of science from the time of Engels down to his own time, as well as the subjecting to comprehensive criticism the anti-materialistic trends among Marxists. Engels said that materialism must assume a new aspect with every new great discovery. It is well known that none other than Lenin accomplished this task for his own time in his remarkable work Materialism and Empirio-Criticism. It is well known that Plekhanov, who loved to chaff Stalin about his unconcern for philosophy, did not even dare to make serious attempt to undertake such a task. Ozzy.
2. Criticism of the theory of spontaneity, or the role of the vanguard in the movement. The theory of spontaneity is a theory of opportunism, a theory of worshipping the spontaneity of the labour movement, a theory which actually repudiates the leading role of the vanguard of the working class, of the party of the working class. The theory of worshipping spontaneity is decidedly opposed to the revolutionary character of the working class movement. It is opposed to the movement taking a line of struggle against the foundations of capitalism. It is in favour of the movement proceeding exclusively along the lines of realisable demands acceptable to capitalism. It is wholly in favour of the line of least resistance. The theory of spontaneity is the ideology of trade unionism.
The theory of worshipping spontaneity is decidedly opposed to giving the spontaneous movement of politically conscious planned character. It is opposed to the party marching at the head of the working class, to the party raising the masses to the level of political consciousness, to the party leading the movement. It is in favor of the politically conscious elements of the movement not hindering not hindering the movement from taking its own course. It is in favor of the party only heeding the spontaneous movement and dragging at the tail of it. The theory of spontaneity is the theory of belittling the role of the conscious element in the movement, the ideology of quotism, the logical basis of all opportunism.
In practice, this theory, which appeared on the scene even before the first revolution in Russia, led its adherents, the so-called economists, to deny the need for an independent workers' party in Russia, to depose the revolutionary struggle of the working class for the overthrow of Tsarism, to preach a purely trade unionist policy and the movement, and in general, to surrender the labor movement to the hegemony of liberal bourgeoisie.
The fight of the old Iskra and the brilliant criticism of the theory of Kovatsism in Lenin's pamphlet, What is to be Done, not only smashed a so-called economism, but also created the theoretical foundations for a truly revolutionary movement of the Russian working class.
Without this fight, it would have been quite useless even to think of creating an independent workers' party in Russia, and of its playing a leading part in the revolution. But the theory of worshipping spontaneity is not an exclusively Russian phenomenon. It is an extremely widespread in somewhat different form. It is true in all parties in the Second International without exception. I have in mind the so-called productive forces theory, as debased by the leaders of the Second International, which justifies everything and conciliates everybody, which records facts and explains them after everybody has become sick and tired of them, and, having recorded them, rests content. Marx said the materialist theory could not confine itself to explaining the world, it must also change it. But Kautsky and Co. are not concerned with this. They prefer to rest content with the first part of Marx's formula.
Here is one of the numerous examples of the application of this theory. It is said that before the imperialist war, the parties of the Second International threatened to declare war against war. If the imperialists should start a war, it is said that on the very eve of the war, these parties pigeonholed the war against war slogan and applied it to the opposite one, viz. War for the imperialist fatherland. It is said that as a result of this change of the slogan, millions of workers were sent to their death. But it would be a mistake to think that there were some people to blame for this, that someone was unfaithful to the working class or betrayed it. Not at all. Everything happened as it should have happened. Firstly, because the International, it seems, is an instrument of peace and not of war. Secondly, because in view of the level of productive forces which then prevailed, nothing else could be done. The productive forces are to blame. That is the precise explanation vouchsafed to us by Mr. Kautsky, theory of the productive forces. And whoever does not believe in that theory is not a Marxist. The role of the parties, their importance of the movement, but what can a party do against a decisive factor as the level of productive forces?
One could cite a host of similar examples of the falsifications of Marxism. It scarcely needs proof that this spurious Marxism, designed to hide the nakedness of opportunism, is merely a European variety of self-same theory of Kovtsism, which Lenin fought even before the first Russian Revolution. It scarcely needs proof that the demolition of this theoretical falsification is a preliminary condition for the creation of truly revolutionary parties in the West.
3. The theory of proletarian revolution. The Leninist theory of the proletarian revolution proceeds from 3 fundamental theses. First thesis, the domination of finance capital in the advanced capitalist countries. The issue of stocks and bonds as one of the principal operations of finance capital. The export of capital to the sources of raw materials, which is one of the foundations of imperialism. the omnipotence of a financial oligarchy, which is the result of the domination of finance capital. All this reveals the grossly parasitic character of monopolist capitalism, makes the yoke of the capitalist trusts and syndicates 100 times more burdensome, quickens the revolt of the working class against the foundations of capitalism, and brings the masses to the proletarian revolution as their only salvation. Hence, the first conclusion, the intensification of the revolutionary crisis within the capitalist countries and growth of the elements of the explosion on the internal proletarian front in the mother countries. Ozzy.
You are muted, Comrade Ozzy.
Sorry, say again. You hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Cool.
Second thesis.
Second thesis. The increase in the export of capital to the colonies and dependent countries. The expansion of spheres of influence and colonial possessions until they cover the whole globe. Transformation of capitalism into a world system of financial enslavement and colonial oppression of the vast majority of the population of the world by a handful of advanced countries. All this has, on one hand, converted the separate national economies and national territories into links in a single chain called world economy, and on the other hand, split the population of the globe into two camps. A handful of advanced capitalist countries, which exploit and oppress vast colonies and dependencies, and the huge majority consisting of colonial and dependent countries which are compelled to wage a struggle for liberation from the imperialist yoke. See imperialism.
Hence, the second conclusion, intensification of the revolutionary crisis in the colonial countries and growth of the elements of revolt against imperialism on the external colonial front. Third thesis, monopolistic possession of spheres of influence and colonies. The uneven development of the capitalist countries leading to a frenzied struggle for the redivision of the world between the countries which have already seized territories and those claiming their quote-unquote share. Imperialist wars as the only means of restoring the disturbed equilibrium. All this leads to the intensification of the struggle in the third front, the intercapitalist front, which weakens imperialism and facilitates the union of the first two fronts against imperialism, the front of the revolutionary proletariat and the front of the colonial emancipation, see imperialism.
Hence, the third conclusion that under imperialism, wars cannot be averted, and that a coalition between the proletarian revolution in Europe and the colonial revolution in the East, and a united world front of revolution against the world front of imperialism is inevitable.
Lenin combines all these conclusions onto the general conclusion that imperialism is the eve of a socialist revolution from his selected works, Volume 5, Part 5. The very approach to the question of the proletarian revolution, of the character of the revolution, of its scope, of its depth, the scheme of the revolution in general changes accordingly.
Formerly, the analysis of the prerequisites for the proletarian revolution was usually approached from the point of view of the economic state of individual countries. Now, this approach is no longer adequate. Now, the matter must be approached from the point of view of the economic state of all or the majority of countries, from the point of view of the state of the world economy. For individual countries and individual national economies have ceased to be self-sufficient units, have become links in a single chain called world economy. For the old cultured capitalism has evolved into imperialism, and imperialism is a world system of financial enslavement and colonial oppression of the vast majority of the population of the world by a handful of advanced countries.
Formerly, it was the accepted thing to speak of the existence or absence of the objective conditions for the proletarian revolution in the individual countries, or, to be more precise, in one or another developed country. Now, this point of view is no longer adequate. Now we must speak of the existence of the objective conditions for revolution in the entire system of world imperialist economy as an integral whole. The existence within this system of some countries that are not sufficiently developed industrially cannot serve as an insuperable obstacle to the revolution. If the system as a whole, or more correctly, because the system as a whole is already ripe for revolution.
Formerly, it was the accepted thing to speak of the proletarian revolution and one or another developed country as of a separate and self-sufficient entity opposing a separate national front of capital as its antipode. Now, the point of view is no longer adequate. Now we must speak of the world proletarian revolution, for the separate national fronts of capital have become links in a single chain, called the world front of imperialism, which must be opposed by a common front of the revolutionary movement in all countries.
Formerly, the proletarian revolution was regarded exclusively as the result of the internal development of a given country. Now, this point of view is no longer adequate. Now, the proletarian revolution must be regarded primarily as a result of the development of the contradictions within the world system of imperialism, as a result of the snapping of the chain of the imperialist world front in one another country. Where will the revolution begin? Where, in what country, the front of capital appears first? Where industry is more developed, where the proletarian constitutes the majority, where there is more culture, where there is more democracy. That was the reply usually given formally.
No, objects the Leninist theory of revolution. Not necessarily where industry is more developed, and so forth. The front of capital will be pierced where the chain of imperialism is weakest. For the proletarian revolution is a result of breaking of the chain of world imperialist front at its weakest link. And it may turn out that the country which has started the revolution, which has made a breach in the front of capital, is less developed in a capitalist sense than other more developed countries, which have, however, remained within the framework of capitalism.
In 1917, the chains of the imperialist world front proved to be weaker in Russia than in the other countries. It was there that the chain broke and provided an outlet for the proletarian revolution. Why? Because in Russian, a greater popular revolution was unfolding, and at its head marched the revolutionary proletariat, which had such an important ally as the vast mass of the peasantry, which was oppressed and exploited by the landlords. Because the revolution there was opposed by such a hideous representative of imperialism as Tsarism, which lacked all moral prestige and deservedly hated by the whole Russian population. The chain proved to be weaker in Russia, although Russia was less developed in a capitalist sense than, say, France or Germany, Britain or America.
Where will the chain break in the near future? Again, where is it weakest? It is not precluded that the chain may break, say, in India. Why? Because that country has a young, militant, revolutionary proletariat, which has such an ally as the National Liberation Movement. An undoubtedly powerful, an undoubtedly important ally, because there the revolution is confronted by such a well-known foe as foreign imperialism, which has no moral credit and is deservedly hated by all the oppressed and exploited masses in India.
It is also quite possible that the chain will break in Germany. Why? Because the factors which are operating, say, in India are beginning to operate in Germany as well. But of course, the enormous difference in the level of development between India and Germany cannot but stamp its imprint on the progress and outcome of the revolution in Germany. That is why Lenin said that the West European capitalist countries are consummating the development towards socialism, not by the gradual maturing of socialism, but by the exploitation of some countries by others, by the exploitation of the first of the countries to be vanquished in the imperialist war, combined with the exploitation of the whole of the East. On the other hand, precisely as a result of the first imperialist war, the East has been definitely drawn into the revolutionary movement, has been definitely drawn into the general maelstrom of the world revolutionary movement. Lenin Selected Works, Volume 9, page 399.
Briefly, the chain of the imperialist front must, as a rule, break where the links are weaker, and, at all events, not necessarily where capitalism is more developed, where there is such and such a brief percentage of proletarians and such a percentage of peasants and so on. That is why, in deciding the question of proletarian revolution proletarian revolution statistical estimates of the percentage of the proletarian population in a given country lose exceptional importance, so eagerly attached to them by the doctrines of the Second International, who have not understood imperialism and who fear revolution like the plague. The next one's really big. Do you want me to do that, or do you want to do that, Connor?
Could you do it, please?
To proceed, the heroes of the Second International asserted, and continue to assert, that between the bourgeois democratic revolution and the proletarian revolution, there is a chasm, or at any rate a Chinese war, separating one from the other by a more or less protracted interval of time, during which the bourgeoisie, having come into power, develops capitalism, while the proletariat accumulates strength and prepares for the decisive struggle against capitalism. This interval is usually calculated to extend over many decades, if not longer. It scarcely needs proof that this Chinese war theory is totally devoid of scientific meaning under the conditions of imperialism, that it is, and can only be, a means of concealing and camouflaging the counter-revolutionary aspirations of the bourgeoisie. It scarcely needs proof that under the conditions of imperialism, fraught as it is with collisions and wars, under the conditions of the eve of socialist revolution, when flourishing capitalism becomes moribund capitalism, from Lenin, and the revolutionary movement is growing in all countries of the world, when imperialism itself is allying with all the reactionary forces without exception, down to and including Tsarism and serfdom, thus making imperative the coalition of all revolutionary forces, from the proletarian movement of the West to the national liberation movement of the East, when the overthrow of the survivals of the regime of feudal serfdom becomes impossible without a revolutionary struggle against imperialism. It scarcely needs proof that the bourgeois democratic revolution in a more or less developed country must, under such circumstances, verge upon the proletarian revolution, that the former must pass into the latter. The history of the revolution in Russia has provided palpable proof that this thesis is correct and incontrovertible. It was not without reason that Lenin, as far back as 1905, on the eve of the First Russian Revolution, in his pamphlet, Two Tactics, depicted the bourgeois democratic revolution and the socialist revolution as two links in the same chain, as a single and integral part of the sweep of the Russian Revolution. To quote, "The proletariat must carry to completion the democratic revolution by allying itself to the masses of the peasantry in order to crush by force the resistance of the autocracy and to paralyze the instability of the bourgeoisie. The proletariat must accomplish the socialist revolution by allying to itself the mass of the semi-proletarian elements of the population in order to crush by force the resistance of the bourgeoisie and to paralyze the instability of the peasantry and the petty bourgeoisie. Such are the links of the proletariat, which the new Iskraists present so narrowly in all their arguments and resolutions about the sweep of the revolution. See Lenin, Volume 8, page 96." End quote.
There's no need to mention other later works of Lenin's in which the idea of the bourgeoisie revolution passing into the proletarian revolution stands out in greater relief than in Two Tactics, as one of the cornerstones of the Leninist theory of revolution.
Some comrade believes, it seems, that Lenin arrived at this idea only in 1916, that up to that line he had thought that the revolution in Russia would remain within bourgeois framework, that power, consequently, would pass from the hands of the organ of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry and the hands of the bourgeoisie, and not of the proletariat. It is said that the assertion has even penetrated into our communist press. I must say that this assertion is absolutely wrong, that it is totally at variance with the facts.
I might refer to Lenin's well-known speech at the Third Congress of the Party, 1905, in which he described the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, that is, the victory of the democratic revolution, not as the organisation of order, but as the organisation of war. That's from Lenin's Collected Works, Russian edition, Volume 7, page 264.
Further, I might refer to Lenin's well-known articles on the Provisional Government from 1905, where, outlining the prospects of the unfolding Russian Revolution, he assigns to the party the task of ensuring that the Russian Revolution is not a movement of a few months, but a movement of many years. that it leads not merely to slight concessions on the parts of the powers that be, but to the complete overthrow of those powers. Where, enlarging further on these prospects and linking them with the revolution in Europe, he goes on to say, quote, "And if we succeed in doing that, then the revolutionary conflagration will spread all over Europe. The European worker, languishing under bourgeois reaction, will rise in his turn and will show us how it is done. And then the revolutionary wave in Europe will sweep back again into Russia and will convert an epoch of a few revolutionary years into an epoch of several revolutionary decades." See page 191. End quote.
I might further refer to the well-known article by Lenin published in November 1915, in which he writes, "The proletariat is fighting and will fight valiantly to capture power for a republic, for the confiscation of the land, for the participation of the non-proletarian masses of the people, in liberating bourgeois Russia from military feudal imperialism, equals Tsarism, and the proletariat will immediately take advantage of of this liberation of bourgeois Russia from Tsarism, from the agrarian power of the landlords, not to aid the rich peasants in their struggle against the rural worker, but to bring about the socialist revolution in alliance with the proletarians of Europe." See volume 18, page 3.
Finally, I might refer to the well-known passage in Lenin's pamphlet, The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky, where, referring to the above quote passage in Two Tactics on the sweep of the Russian Revolution, he arrives at the following conclusion: "Things turned out just as we said they would. The course taken by the revolution confirmed the correctness of our reasoning. First, with the whole of the peasantry against monarchy, against the landlords, against the medieval regime, and to the extent the revolution remains bourgeois democratic, then with the poor peasants, with the semi-proletarians, with all the exploited against capitalism, including the rural rich, the kulaks, the profiteers, and that extent the revolution becomes a socialist one. To attempt to raise an artificial Chinese wall between the first and second, to separate them by anything else than the degree of preparedness of the proletarian and degree of its unity with the poor peasants, means monstrously to distort Marxism, to vulgarize it, to replace it by liberalism. This is insufficient, I think."
Enough, I think. Very well, we may be told. But if this be the case, why did Lenin combat the idea of permanent, uninterrupted revolution? Because Lenin proposed that the revolutionary capacities of the peasantry be utilised to the utmost, I repeat that, to the utmost, and that their fullest use be made of their revolutionary energy for the complete liquidation of Tsarism and for the transition to the proletarian revolution, whereas the adherents of permanent revolution did not understand the important role of the peasantry in the Russian Revolution, underestimated the strength of the revolutionary energy of the peasantry, underestimated the strength and capacity of the Russian proletariat to lead the peasantry, and thereby hampered the work of emancipating the peasantry from the influence of the bourgeoisie, the work of rallying the peasantry around the proletariat.
Because Lenin proposed that the revolution be crowned with the transfer of power to the proletariat, whereas the adherents of permanent revolution wanted to begin at once with the establishment of the power of the proletariat, failing to realize that in so doing they were closing their eyes to such a minor detail as the survivals of serfdom, and were leaving out of account so important a force as the Russian peasantry, failing to understand that such a policy could only retard the winning of the peasantry over to the side of the proletariat. Consequently, Lenin fought the adherents of permanent revolution, not over the question of uninterruptedness, for Lenin himself maintained the point of view of uninterrupted revolution, but because they underestimated the role of the peasantry, which is an enormous reserve of the proletariat, because they failed to understand the idea of hegemony of the proletariat.
The idea of permanent revolution should not be regarded as a new idea. It was first advanced by Marx at the end of the 40s in his well-known address to the Communist League, 1850. It was from this document that our permanentists took the idea of uninterrupted revolution. It should be noted that in taking it from Marx, our permanentists altered it somewhat, and altering it, it spoiled it, made it unfit for practical use. The experienced hand of Lenin was needed to rectify this mistake, to take Marx's idea of uninterrupted revolution in its pure form and to make it a cornerstone of his theory of revolution.
Here is what Marx says in his address about uninterrupted permanent revolution. After enumerating a number of revolutionary democratic demands which he called upon the communists to win. While the democratic petty bourgeoisie wished to bring the revolution to a conclusion as quickly as possible, and with the achievement at most of the above demands, it is our interest and our task to make the revolutionary permanent, until all more or less possessing classes have been forced out of their position of dominance, until the proletariat has conquered state power and the association of proletarians, not only in one country, but in all the dominant countries of the world, has advanced so far that competition among the proletarians of these countries has ceased, and that at least the divisive productive forces are concentrated in the hands of the proletarians.
In other words, Marx did not propose to begin the revolution in the Germany of the 50s, that's the 1850s, with the immediate establishment of the proletarian power, contrary to the plans of our Russian permanentists. B. Marx proposed only that the work of the revolution be crowned with the establishment of proletarian state power, by hurling, step by step, one section of the bourgeoisie after another from the heights of power, in order, after the attainment of power by the proletariat, to kindle the fire of revolution in every country and everything that Lenin taught, and carried out in the course of our revolution in pursuit of his history of the proletarian revolution under conditions of imperialism, was fully in line with that proposition.
It follows then that our Russian permanentists have not only underestimated the role of the peasantry in the Russian Revolution and the importance of the idea of hegemony of the proletariat, but have altered, for the worse, Marx's idea of permanent revolution and made it unfit for practical use. That is why Lenin ridiculed the theory of our permanentists, calling it original and fine, and accusing them of refusing to think why for 10 whole years life has passed by this fine theory. Lenin's article was written in 1915, 10 years after the appearance of the theory of the permanentists in Russia. See volume 18, page 317.
This is why Lenin regarded this theory as semi-Menshevik, a semi-Menshevik theory, and said that it borrows from the Bolsheviks on their call for a resolute revolutionary struggle by the proletariat and the conquest of political power by the latter from the Mensheviks, the repudiate the role of the peasantry. This then, or see Lenin's article, 2 Lines of the Revolution. This then is the position in regard to Lenin's idea of the bourgeois democratic revolution passing into the proletarian revolution, of utilizing the bourgeois revolution for the immediate transition to the proletarian revolution.
To proceed, formally, the victory of the revolution in one country was considered impossible, on the assumption that it would require the combined action of proletarians of all, or at least the majority of the advanced countries to achieve victory over the bourgeoisie. Now this point of view no longer fits in with the facts. Now we must proceed from the possibility of such a victory for the uneven and spasmodic character of the development of the various capitalist countries under the conditions of imperialism, the development within imperialism of catastrophic contradictions leading to inevitable war, the growth of the revolutionary movement in all countries of the world. All this leads not only to the possibility, but also to necessity of the victory of the proletariat in individual countries. The history of revolution in Russia is direct proof of this. At the same time, however, it must be borne in mind that the overthrow of the bourgeoisie can be successfully accomplished only when certain absolutely necessary conditions exist, in the absence of which there can be even no question of the proletariat taking power.
Here is what Lenin says about these conditions in his pamphlet, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. Quote, the fundamental law of revolution, which has been confirmed by all revolutions, and particularly by all three Russian revolutions in the 20th century, is as follows. It is not enough for revolution that the exploited and oppressed masses should understand the impossibility of living in the old way and demanding changes. It is essential for revolution that the exploiters should not be able to live and rule in the old way. Only when the lower classes do not want the old way, and when the upper classes cannot carry on in the old way, only then can revolution triumph. This truth may be expressed in other words. Revolution is impossible without a nationwide crisis affecting both the exploited and the exploiters. It follows that for revolution, it is essential, first, that the majority of the workers, or at least the majority of the class-conscious thinking, politically active workers, should fully understand that revolution is necessary and be ready to sacrifice their lives for it. Secondly, that the ruling classes should be passing through a governmental crisis, which draws even the most backward masses into politics, weaken the government and make it possible for the revolutionaries to overthrow it rapidly. From Lenin's Selected Works, Volume 10, page 127.
But the overthrow of the power of the bourgeoisie and establishment of the power of the proletariat in one country does not yet mean that the complete history of socialism has been ensured. After consolidating its power and leading the peasantry in its wake, the proletariat of the victorious country can and must build a socialist society. But does this mean that it will thereby achieve the complete and final victory of socialism? I.e., does it mean that with the forces of only one country it can finally consolidate socialism and fully guarantee that country against intervention and consequently also against restoration? No, it does not. For this is the victory of the revolution in at least several countries is needed. Therefore, the development and support of the revolution in other countries is an essential task of the victorious revolution. Therefore, the revolution which has been victorious in one country must regard itself not as a self-sufficient entity, but as an aid, as a means for hastening the victory of the proletariat in other countries. Lenin expressed this thought succinctly when he said that the task of the victorious revolution is to do the utmost possible in one country for the development, support, and awakening of revolution in all countries. See Volume 23, page 385. These, in general, are the characteristic features of Lenin's theory of proletarian revolution. End chapter.
Right on. Everyone can take a breath for a moment. That was very good. We went through that rather quickly and rather accurately. Have some very good dictators. Well, we have some good dictators in another sense, not the dictator of the proletariat, but those with diction. It's very good. So let's just do a round of initial responses to the material. It's actually been a minute since I've gone over this, but it had such an impression on me that it immediately took me back to the first time reading it, and it's super exciting. I mean, you got to think about this: the person writing this, is putting in Stalin, is putting in their own words, the complete transformation of society in Russia, which went from feudalism to a bourgeois revolution and very quickly into a socialist revolution. Within a matter of years. And now Stalin is leading the first large socialist revolution, having huge advancements, electrification of the country, unprecedented industrialization. Go ahead, Ozzy.
Yeah, I just wanted to say it's just so absolutely fucking stark, the difference between socialist country leaders and people in the West. Margaret Thatcher doesn't write theory. George Bush doesn't write theory. Xi Jinping writes theory. Deng Xiaoping writes theory. Mao writes theory. Ho Chi Minh writes theory. Stalin writes theory. But do you hear anything from the West? No, because they're not leaders. They're just freaking puppets, and nothing makes it more obvious than this stuff right here.
Very powerful. So,
can I sort of add something
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Comrade
this
Fox.
what's also important about this writing about for all those leading societal change or social change. They're the ones who are actually right. This shows you they've got the actual concrete evidence. They've done the actual practice. They've put it into writing, and they've given and shown in clear example. This is the way forward. What to keep in mind. Okay, it was relevant to the conditions of their country at that time, but also too, there's a lot to learn from it. And I think this is how international it is as well. And yeah, this is what it's interesting when I hear people, they've got their own theories about things, but nothing's being put into practice. It's just like someone's got a thought in their head and think they're right. No, well, this stuff didn't just come out of a thought in someone's head. This actually came out of real life experience. This is what's really good about this stuff. So theory and practice go together. They're not separate. Yeah, this is where this goes together.
Very powerful.
Yeah,
Comrade
I just want to. Another thing I want to make evident is that no one else had ever done what these people were doing before. This was they had no rule, but they didn't have foundations of Leninism. Someone had to write that, and this is what is happening right in front of us right now. And I feel like we're so fortunate to be able to have this material and look back at it and be able to learn from it. And I was just thinking that there's an entire generation of Marxist-Leninists in this country that I know about. I don't know about other countries that never read this because of de-Stalinization and it's just it's amazing to me because of how brilliant and foundational it is. You know, that the 20th century was the great experiment into socialism for the very first time, and these people are writing it down with their social practice and teaching us correct ideas that they've learned from that social practice. It's just amazing.
Very, very powerful. You know, I first read this when I was in college, and I remember I had worked. My first job at 18 was working in the poultry plant, the meat packaging of chicken, and cutting up chicken. And I remember the majority of the workforce was undocumented workers from Mexico and Latin America. I remember walking through to get into the factory. There was two different gates, and the one gate had barbed wire, and it was all metal, and it was kind of like these rotating metal gates where there was three prongs, and it would turn, and you go in, barbed wire above it. It was dirty, it was cold, and that is where the mostly black and brown and working class people went in to cut the chicken. And the other side had these beautiful manicured bushes, landscaped, sidewalk, nice pretty glass doors, and that is where, you know, the white collar workers, the salespeople, as well as the people they were selling to and doing business, were working in. And you know, and as a young person, that just, it really got to me and said something is wrong. Something is wrong with our society. So the first time I read this material, and I was like, these people did something about what is wrong with our society. So, I mean, it left a lasting emotional and spiritual impression on me. What they were able to do in such a short amount of time, and very concisely and materially, and the way they explained it. Maybe we can. I wanted to have a first go around, but it kind of went into a conversation. Maybe we can do that we can finish off, you know, our initial response, starting with David and going around. Comrade Fox?
Well, what I said, I think there's a lot to cover within that as well, and I want to talk a little bit about too what they meant by spontaneity, independent worker party, economism, and liberalism. And I think, you know, liberalism is definitely a big talk about this talking point today, and personally how they dealt with it back in their time, but how we can deal with that now. I think that's vitally important, and I'm making sure actually when all this came out. This is great theory, and also too, I think it's like, you know, Stalin's been so demonized and all that. I think, well, it's done deliberately to actually stop the working class breaching their historical mission, which is the overthrow of capitalism, imperialism, and bring on towards socialism. So this is like basically bang, it's opened up a whole new door altogether. It's like some of its examples, like you're just lifting the veil of a curtain up, you just walk outside, you can see the world completely differently, and that's what I've experienced with it all as well. It's like, yeah, you see things in a completely different perspective now. We didn't just happen to be here. We didn't just know things just don't happen. We just didn't happen overnight or whatever. There's a whole list of things, and it's just amazing when you can have a look at the world that way. I think, right, now we can do something different because what we've been going on before and hasn't worked.
Comrade Ozzy?
I think it's also telling in a scientific kind of way. One of the ways that science works is by making falsifiable predictions. And at the time that Lenin was doing his writing, depending on which bit of stuff you were reading, either the revolution hadn't happened yet or it had just happened and they were sort of puzzling it out. And then he writes his bit, Stalin writes this as well to expand upon it. And then, lo and behold, it's proved right in multiple countries. So, like Marx had the idea that socialism required developed societies to have the developed productive forces so that you could have socialism. And that was true. But he also missed out that that's not where revolutions happen, which is why just about every revolution that's ever happened has happened in some undeveloped country because that's where the chain is weakest. And then their first task is to build up the country. And you see that everywhere, from Cuba to Vietnam to China to Russia back in the day as well.
Comrade Gillis?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that really jumped out to me while reading it was just whenever they're talking about Lenin's theory of imperialism throughout that, and how, like you said, Marx and the Kautskyeites and people like that, and Trotsky, they all believed that the revolution was going to come in these developed places first, and that you know, they kept talking about the science of productive forces. You know, you have to have these productive forces built up first. But it turns out that, like it said, the revolution will come where the link in imperialism is the weakest. And we can see where that happened after the Bolshevik Revolution. We see it arising in places like China and Vietnam. And, you know, they may have not guessed correctly, you know, with India, but nonetheless, the predictions about where these revolutions would arise was proven to be correct. Like you were saying, like we have hindsight on our side, but a lot of the things that these people were saying, you know, a century ago, proved to be correct, which is amazing.
Comrade Fox, did you have something to add?
Well,
go ahead.
Well, actually, that's part of what I want to talk about is the importance about that, where the chain of imperialism is the weakest. And it was like the person was a YouTube personality or media commentator shall remain unnamed. But when he says workers in the so-called Western or First World have not revolutionary potential, I think that's what he sort of missed the point, where what we're reading out here is matter is in motion. It's in constant state of change. Everything else. How does he know that will never happen in the, say, for example, the USA, Australia, New Zealand? Who knows? You know, it's not him to decide where it says. Yeah, it looks like obviously places like South and Central America, very big obvious areas, and other places throughout Asia and Africa as well. Yes, it looks obvious, but who's to say? Everything's in a constant state of change, and that's why I think we have to remind that point is it's where the chain of imperialism is at the weakest. Its weakest point. That's where it's going to happen, not stronger. So, and it can happen, and it can happen very quickly. It can happen very slowly, and I think that's where we've got to keep to the science of it and adopt it to the. That's why we need to apply scientific socialism to the respective material conditions we live under. We've got no choice to that, but it might be slight one day, but things are moving very quickly these days. So, you know, this time next year, we could be in a complete different scenario. So,
Very well spoken, Comrade Fox. So we went around and we had our initial impressions. We're starting to get into a little bit of the text of what it's actually saying, getting into the summary, and hopefully we can also, you know, further apply it, you know, to conditions to events and conditions that happen after, as well as the current day. I think one of the points that stuck out to me, I really liked the quote here about. I think I refer to Lenin's well-known speech at the Third Congress Party, 1905, in which he defined the dictatorship of the proletarian, the peasantry, the victory of the democratic, not as the order, but as the organization of war. And I thought that was, that was very, it spoke to me that, you get like, let's talk about like Trump or Reagan or some of these kind of right-wing figures, and they always talk about how they are the party of law and order. They are the strength. We could talk about Duterte. We can talk about Bolsonaro, and they are the ones that stop the chaos. They go after supposedly they go after the drug dealers. They go after lumpen proletariat. The war on Reagan with the war on drugs, and in reality, their economic ideology, neoliberalism, really is not of peace, is not of order, but is of chaos and war and violence. The way they destroy countries, the way NAFTA, destroyed and put all of the Mexican farmers out of business, forced people across the border, and then Clinton militarized the border. And people don't. And let's talk about the crime bill too. While we're at it, Joe Biden, the current president, passed the crime bill and says, "Oh, if just because you're a Democrat doesn't mean you're not tough on crime." And then Kamala Harris was, a horrible, despotic prosecutor who kept people in jail to use them as slave labor, long after that. And I think a lot of the ultra types who go around and constantly say, we must have a violent revolution. If you do not have a gun, you are not a revolutionary. Venezuelans didn't really have a socialist revolution because they used the ballot box. The Bolivians didn't really have a revolution because it doesn't matter that the entirety of the masses rose up, took power, and have materially changed their society because they didn't do it a specific way with a vanguard and a gun. It isn't a revolution. And I think that distorts things. And that is what working class socialism is getting back to. I mean, we had the New Left, and we had the Maoist, and we had a socialist movement in the United States that was not hooked to the working class like it was in the 30s and 40s. I think this is very important today, that we go to the people and we say, we want peace in your community. We want an end to the drug trade in your community. We want an end to the sex slavery and trafficking in your community. And we want a more efficient and effective economic system to raise your conditions and to create a more fulfilling, stable life and improve the life of your family. And I think Lenin got that as a revolution. We need to bring back Leninism to Marxism of today. Let's see. Any response to that point?
Well,
Comrade Gillis, go ahead.
I was just going to say, whenever you said we need to go back into these communities and tell them we want to bring peace to your communities and all these things, it just reminds me of what the Bolsheviks did. What was their slogan? It was very simple: peace, land, and bread. We're going to. None of these things are explicitly Marxist. They're actually very populist. And you go out and into the, it's a very populist ideology, getting into the masses and understanding what they need, appealing to their sensibilities, uplifting their conditions. And if you can do that, they'll fight the class war for you to the very end.
Comrade Fox?
And I think we're talking about, we'll talk about liberalism or neoliberalism now. Our age, I understand what that is. That's a policy, not just a war on the developing world or third world, but it's a war on the working class in our own communities, everything else. It decimates our working class communities. It causes destabilization using drugs. When we talk about the war on drugs, all factors, it was a war on the working class, giving them drugs to destabilize their community even further. And we've got to understand that liberalism itself destabilizes both indigenous and working class communities right across the broad, right across the spectrum. It's done deliberately. Why? Because the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, are scared of organised working class. And then just people, if we all stand united and strong, and that will be an unbeatable force. But while they keep it all unstable or destabilised, causing conflict amongst ourselves and other nations, causing endless poverty, and causes all sorts of social problems they're trying to distract us with, to deflect any attention from them. That's where they need to keep us being, because otherwise they know full well as soon as everyone's woken up to the facts going on, they'll be in some serious danger. So I think I've heard this talked about before, but I think part of it too, we also understand the ideology of liberalism or neoliberalism, free trade, etc. It's more than just about extracting more profits. It's also about keeping us all destabilized and divided and fighting amongst ourselves.
I just wanted to make a point of clarification before we move on, and shout out to Lumpia Logic, which I believe has links to the Philippines. And she raises a good point that Duterte is a populist, beloved by the people. That's an interesting statement, as well as Duterte is anti-austerity. Now, the reason why I rose Duterte in the context of these right-wing, neoliberal figures is because he really did start out as, going militantly hard against drug dealers. And that was actually a very popular policy because drugs were a horrible thing in the Philippines. But I think, and even the Chinese supported Duterte. A lot of people were happy that Duterte came to power and supported them, thinking that he would be, along the correct, main contradiction today, which is anti-imperialism. A lot of people thought he would be an anti-imperialist, but I would say that his actions, have proven otherwise. He's gone along with imperialism to an extent, and he is also, gone against all the other anti-imperialist forces. I'd love to hear your response back, Lumpia Logic. Let's see, Comrade Ozzy, any response to that specific point about law and order and peace?
No. Yeah, but no. The Duterte thing, I've seen information going the other way. I'm not from that area and have no particular links to it, so I'm just going to rely on other people to tell me whether a particular thing is headed in the right direction or not. As to the other, I think the old saying, or the paraphrasing is, the last capitalist will sell us the rope by which we hang them. This neoliberalism stuff, it's great for, destabilizing, as you say, but it's also, when they bring the policies home, that's when things start to go wrong for them. Because they are creating the very conditions by which they push for revolution in some form or another. May not be the revolution that we want, but definitely something is going to happen. And they can't help themselves. And the smarter ones know that this policy of just starving the masses, even if they're not actually Marxists, they know it's counterproductive. But they can't help themselves, because if they don't push for the policies that starve the masses, then somebody else will make huge profits and they won't, and they'll be screwed. So they know they're headed for a cliff, and they can't stop themselves going over the cliff. They just have to run faster than the other guy, and sooner or later they're going to head over the cliff. Who's waiting for them at the bottom? That's another story.
So just highlight Lumpia Logic's Filipino Maoists are the adventurous, hated by the masses. I'm a Filipino American. Thank you, Lumpia Logic, and we really appreciate your insights here.
Yeah,
so
this is the sort of thing I've heard too.
So I raised a point. Does any of the other comrades have a specific point in the article that they found interesting or compelling?
Well, actually, I decided to talk a little bit about that spontaneity. It was actually resonant, and I think there's some confusion. I think it's just something that responds all of a sudden about something and then disappears overnight. It doesn't what it's been, and I think we regard with the unions like economism and all that. And basically, you could say there's a union struggle about something, but you could call that a spontaneous struggle. And I think that's what and it's within the realms of economism. So basically, traditionally, wages and conditions strike. I think the question, which are vitally important. Don't get me wrong. I'm involved in the unions because, of course, it'd be important. But then, what happens? But also still recognise those even with those immediate struggles, they might be spontaneous, where the upside of things, they can be developed into bigger struggles for political and social change. How do we make those connections? Otherwise, they will stay as spontaneous struggles within, that's what I wanted to say, within the existing realms of capitalism within that order. And they'll just keep going around the same in the same ditch over and over again. But at the end of the day, where the capitalist order is not really threatened, it's still intact, where what Lenin was talking about here is about moving into a higher level struggle where that capitalist order is threatened and it's removed and socialism is put in place. I think it's something where linking it up. I've had these many discussions over years about strikes and struggles and etc. But I wonder how to link it all up and how to develop them from lower to higher levels of struggle, because you've got the three forms of struggle: economic, political, and ideological, and they all three go together. So how we turn the lower form of struggle to a higher form of struggle, and it could be a good discussion to have. We don't have to be completely done today, but it's something to put in people's heads to have a think about, and I think it's worthwhile to continue that discussion as well.
So any response from Connor or Ozzy on the idea of spontaneity?
I think it's popular in the US and places like the US. I thought the US is going to be the other example, simply because they have had such a long history of McCarthyism and demonizing communism and anything to do with it. So spontaneity is the only thing they've got left of them, because, anybody with half a brain is going to realize that, well, we need to get organized and we need to have a bunch of people on our side. But because of the history of the US, and I say to some extent it goes to the UK as well, that any attempt to get organized is going to get squashed, infiltrated, and betrayed pretty quickly. So it almost feels like the only thing they've got left is spontaneity.
Comrade Gillis?
Yeah, when it comes to spontaneity, you see it's very popular amongst left communist types and anarchist types, which are very prevalent in the West. Online, especially these days, we find them much easier than we could before. But yeah, I mean, spontaneity is something that it can make gains in the moment. But my feeling about the trade unions is much of the same of what Lenin felt about it. He said, while the trade unions are like the laboratories of the revolution, they're simply a tool. They're not and just like how participating in elections for communists is a tool. The same with trade unions. It can gain us protections, and trade union movement has been, that's where the workers organize, and it can teach workers how to organize. But in the end, I agree with the Leninist point of view, and that's why I'm a Leninist. I agree with what Comrade Fox and what Comrade Ozzy had to say.
I think let me respond before we go on. Was it a quick point of clarification, or was it continued?
Yeah, I just wanted a little point of clarification. Olympia made a little comment about Stalin asked a question: was Stalin against trade unions? No, he wasn't. In fact, read his early works, because he was heavily involved in organising workers and led many strikes as well. No, the Bolsheviks weren't against trade unions. In fact, trade unions existed into the Soviet Union as well, but they developed into a higher form of organisation. And what we're talking about here say, for example, trade union struggle, well, there should be schools of communism, schools of struggle. We can learn some real basic forms of that, but how we develop it now then into higher forms of struggle, that's what we're referring to. Sorry, Dustin.
No, thank you. Thank you for answering that question. I think one of the best examples of spontaneity, in my country, in the United States, is movementism, which is the idea Occupy is the revolution. Black Lives Matter is now the revolution. It's these spontaneous uprising, very positive uprising, either on class or the national issue, are the revolution. And we have seen time and time again that these spontaneous uprisings have been manipulated to use as foot shoulders of one portion of the bourgeoisie against the other. They have been used to and funneled back into the Democratic Party. You can see elements of Occupy becoming the Sanders movement. The same thing with Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter was used to vote Joe Biden and the Democrats back into power. And the thing is, we cannot rely on these spontaneous movements. It's a bit of a balance. So when you're revolutionary and you go out to a mass movement, you do not want to completely rip off elements and join your own revolutionary groups. You want to assist it to an extent. You want your participation in it to be genuine and to add something to it. But you can't take all of your resources and put it into that. You need a revolutionary. So you have to take part in the revolution, take part in spontaneous activities, learn from the spontaneous activities, at the same time teach revolutionary, build your vanguard type organizations, bring people, into these study circles and studying theory, and make long-term, revolutionary, use the spontaneous movements to build, independent, community built revolutionary groups that can push forward. And most of all, when it comes to spontaneous uprisings, it is raise the property question. I mean, they're always going to talk about the bourgeoisie will push all spontaneous movements towards a cultural issue or towards something that doesn't directly confront the imperialist system, because then it pacifies it. And we have to bring up the property question, because that will push for a system change. And that's what Center for Political Innovation does with its 4-point plan: nationalize energy, rebuild infrastructure. We're putting out demands that this current system can't possibly achieve, but building power to achieve revolutionary change. Comrade Ozzy?
Just to add on to that trade union thing, and to feed into the latest sort of internet flap, I guess. Lenin, I think it was Lenin, had something to say about going into reactionary trade unions, in that if there are trade unions that are full of, scumbags with shitty views or whatever, that's where you need to be. Because they're not going to get better by themselves, and they're not going to get persuaded out of those views and out of those reactionary positions unless someone goes and tells them, which means you need to get your ass out of the couch and out of the book reading circle and go there where the people are. Because if we're going into our cute little, I don't know, say there's a left-wing union or something, that's great and all, and it'll, we'll feel good, but then we're not persuading anybody new. Those people are already persuaded. So we need to go where people are who have views that we don't agree with, who don't have the information that we have, and give it to them. And this, I think, is possibly where a lot of that pushback for the whole patriotic socialism thing comes from. Because at its heart, my understanding of the patriotic socialism position is that it's just meet people where they are. You might not be a patriotic person. You might not like the idea of the UK or the USA or whatever, but other people do. Maybe for reasons that are wrong, maybe for reasons that overlook a lot of very important things, but that's where they are. So you need to go and talk to those people in their language. It's the same kind of thing, I think. And I think the reason people are so upset by it is because when you get right down to it, at the end of the day, it means you've got to get outside your cute little leftist bubble and go talk to people who might disagree with you about some really fundamental things, like whether gay people have the right to exist or not. And that's hard.
Let's see, Comrade Gillis, any response to what was raised by Comrade Jones?
Well, I agree. I feel like that going into these reactionary spaces, because, well, I grew up in rural Texas, and a lot of the people that I've been around my entire life have been people that don't necessarily think that I should exist. And that's, and that's not necessary, but I think that I've changed minds. I've changed people's minds about some basic things. Maybe not the big ideas like, oh yeah, now they like Stalin, but maybe we should have some sort of economic revolution, not by being alienated, not by saying, well, you disagree with me on certain things, so now I'm never going to talk to you again. You're not worth my time, blah, blah, blah. Now, these are the people we need to be fighting for, and it's not easy, and you're going to fail a lot, and you're probably going to get your feelings hurt. But, we're communists. We don't have the luxury of just being, quote unquote, regular Joes. We have to put ourselves through a level of uncomfort. No one said that the revolution was going to be a dinner party, and organizing for it isn't necessarily going to be comfortable for you either. And you have to step out of that comfort zone sometimes and reach out to people that don't necessarily see eye to eye with you.
It's hilarious that people will say, I will die for the revolution, but I'm not going to talk to my right-wing neighbors.
Right. Exactly.
Comrade Fox I just want to do a very quick comment. A lot of people will take that revolution is not a dinner party and be like, oh, it's going to have guns and it's going to be bloody. But in reality, when we read that with Zhang Yu, it was actually more talking about the guest list, the variety of the guest list, than it was the actual conditions. Comrade Fox.
Yeah, and it's just good to talk about organising as well. Like, I mean, organiser, but like Boilermaker, my trade background, and been in a union for many, many years now. And obviously, you cannot avoid but meeting people with different views and opinions, and some are just out there reactionary as well at times. And we have to deal with it. But also, there is a good golden rule. What's the 101 of organising? It's actually building the relations with people. Because some people you just might know you want to flog them off, but you actually start building the relationship, developing that trust as well, which is vitally important for what the work we're all trying to do here is to build those relations with people. And look, within our community, well, look, what are you going to say if your whole family's got a completely different view of them? You're going to disown them altogether? I mean, it's like. Everyone's going to have a difference of views and opinions, and that as well. I mean, the fact is here today, we've got to get to the fundamental line of all people's concerns here, and a lot of it's just general and economic concerns. But you find people who are ultra concerned, but they still got concerns about the drug issues affecting their community. Have seen what all the problems and issues that cause the basically systematic breaking down of their communities. They've still got the same. They've got those sort of things, concerns, families splitting up, loss of jobs. They still have that. They might have a completely different angle of looking at it, though. That's what it is. But it's the same thing. It's like looking at my phone. You see this on one side, I'm seeing the other side. But we're all still seeing the same object here. And I think we've got. Look at it this way, and we're all not going to see eye to eye. But yeah, you're right. Like organising, it is pushing us out of our comfort zone. Anything you need to do and improve in it, you've got to be consistently pushed out of that little comfort zone. Otherwise, you're not going to get anywhere. And if you don't want to do that, fine. Well, sit back on the couch, but don't criticise either. Well, let all of us who want to get out there in the real world and do our work. I've actually liked Little Mail's little term when he says, no investigation, no right to talk on it. I also like to say no participation, no right to criticise either. So it's just add that further, because you don't have a right to criticise unless you're actually fully participating. And I think that's vitally important, is to get out there amongst people. It's dying for it. Look, the Comrade Pinko made just a quick mention about it's going faster in Australia, and certainly is. And we've got a big problem now. The rise of the far right here even more now. It's in and also too with all of these rallies and stuff. This is why it's vitally important that we just have to get out here in Australia, and no doubt every other country. Let's get out. This is why we need to get out there and engage with ordinary people. Otherwise, the alternative is not a very, very nice thing at all.
Especially
I wanted to give. Go ahead. I wanted to give a shout out to Comrade Pinko, First Nations comrade in Australia. Comrade Pinko, we're very glad to have your participation here. I would love to have you on the show at some time. Please if you feel that you'd like to come on, please reach out to me on Twitter at DustJames90 on Twitter. Let's go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Comrade Pinko's been on my channel a couple times. Love the guy. He's one of, no offense, David, but he's one of my favorite Australians. He's awesome.
He's good value.
Let's see. This actually goes really good into my next point that I wanted to bring up, and the idea is, what is Marxism? Is Marxism something you confess in your heart and then you're freed of your sins? No, that is not what Marxism is. Marxism where you proclaim to be a Marxist and you are the right beholder of Marx, passed down to you by Lenin and Stalin and Hoxha. And Hoxha was the best Marxist that was actually holding on to that. Is that Marxism? The answer is no. Marxism is a tool. Scientific socialism, dialectic materialism is a tool at understanding the world, and therefore and it's also a guide of actions. So with that understanding, you can change the world and bring it forward. And how is the world moving forward? It's moving forward on material contradictions. It's not moving forward on proclessed ideology. It's not moving forward on what people claim and say they are. It's moving forward because classes are coming into conflict with each other and one class is overtaking another. That is what Marxism, and if people just have that idea, that would clear up a lot of issues. But that was just the preference to my point. I wanted to read here on page 31 if people have this edition, and it talks about the coalition that brought about the revolution in Russia, and it wasn't just the proletarians, and it wasn't just the proletarians and the peasants. If you look here, it says, then with the poor peasants, with the semi-proletarians, with all the exploited against capitalism, including rural rich, the kulaks, the profiteers, and to that extent, the revolution becomes a socialist one. So in this socialist revolution, they had petty bourgeoisie. They even had some lower level landlords, in this coalition. So, this idea that being put out there, that the biggest threat that we have to deal with right now is fascism, which I don't even think the fascists are even near being able to take power, number one. And number two, that the idea that everybody at the January 6th movement was supporting fascism is absolutely ridiculous. If you do a class analysis of a lot of the people that were at the January 6th movement, they were lower level capitalists being kicked out of the capitalist class because of further monopolization. So just because they have they have some right-wing ideology, a lot of them are racists and so on, doesn't mean we don't understand them from their class perspective. And in reality, when our main enemy is the monopoly capitalists, We can win over some of the small level capitalists to the larger anti-imperialist coalition against the monopoly capitalists. And I mean, that's what they did in Russia. And if we're thinking about what we're actually doing now, and we're not talking about stated beliefs and actual class analysis, we need to make as broad statement and build for power against the main enemy today, which is the monopoly capitalist. And in our sense, monopoly capitalism has monopolized and concentrated to a point that I don't even think Lenin really could see in the future. I think Lenin would have thought a revolution would have happened way before now. But that is the main part. Ozzy, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, hey, look, Chinese flag. There's a reason it has all them stars on it, you know, because it's, while yes, the proletariat are the major and most important one, although you could make an argument that in China it was peasants, but it's everybody against the monopoly capitalists. But one of the things I wanted to mention from before was, from our readings, was the making of all of this into one big global system. It gives the system sort of power and flexibility, but I think they've used most of that up. And I think what you're going to see maybe in the next 10 or 20 years or something is when it goes, it's all going to go, and it's all going to go pretty quick, because they've made the whole world into one single system. And so their old story about the domino theory of like one country goes socialist, they'll all go, probably wasn't true at the time. Might be true now.
Very powerful. So I brought up a lot of issues. Comrade Ozzy brought up some issues. Let's see, David and Gillis, any response?
That's you guys.
Oh, yeah, thanks for pointing that out. I really appreciate that. Didn't know. See, I didn't know. I thought going. Sorry, I thought Connor wanted to go first. Sorry.
No, I mean, I think I just agree with the points that everyone here is making, and that I think I agree with what you said, Dust. I don't think Lenin would have predicted. I think that he would have thought revolution would have come before now, and like you said, it didn't happen in the domino effect as they thought it was before. You know, there were parts of history where there was waves where socialist countries were established, but it never was that full domino effect. But it could happen, and as I forget who was saying it earlier, but everything is in motion. I think it was David. Everything is in motion. Whether, you know, there are, you know, we're Marxists. We don't believe in essentialism. There are essential qualities to nothing. Everything is in motion. These concepts are fluid. What is true today may not be true tomorrow. And if the conditions are right, I mean, it very well could be that maybe the next country that goes is India. And I think if, you know, two of the largest countries in the world, in China and India, are both red, that what hope would imperialism and capitalism have? I think the dominoes would start to fall. But, you know, this is all just speculation. I think that what we really have to do is take what we can.
I agree.
Take what we can and apply it to our movement as it exists right now.
Yeah,
is what
because what we're studying here, and all the discussions and study we've done over the last lives, all these lives we've done the last couple of years, we're reminded Marxism is not a dogma. You know, it's it's a science. It's a toolbox to be used and applied to what according to conditions we're operating under with time. And yeah, so there's no actual blueprint plan. Someone sat down at a drawing board and drew up a blueprint plan. This is how we must go forward to it, and apply a one-size-fits-all policy to every country. It certainly doesn't work that way. Never has, never will. And Ozzy's right. This thing could have a quick domino effect, a lightning effect, left, right, and centre all over the country, all over the world. And you know, things are moving very quick. I mean, you're asking me, so like, if we were trying to have this discussion 30, 40 years ago, I reckon it would have been a completely different one, because it was like around completely different time and era. But we're now in the third decade of the 21st century, and it's a very different world to the one it was 30 years ago. And it just, it certainly is a lot of things that are moving. I mean, Venezuela. I mean, back in 1991 was talked about. Neither was Peru or Ecuador or Nicaragua, any of those countries. Or probably wrong, Nicaragua, but none of that and everything else that's been happening. But now it's just time is moving very quick. Surprisingly, over the last year or two, it's moving quicker than what I thought. So I think it's just sometimes I think it's moving too fast. But look, I mean that's not up to me to decide that. I think that's what we understand. We look at the material conditions, our respective countries, how we operate, and how we go about it. And I think it's, employing an analogy. I mean, Comrade Pinko actually made a good analogy there. Australia's now a net importer of food. Yes, we are. It's just ridiculous. We've got the capability of growing our own food. We're an island continental nation. We have to import food? Really? Why? And we should be, a country like ours should be a lot more self-reliant and self-efficient. But obviously under this crazy system we live, it's a worldwide system of imperialism that won't allow Australia to develop further. In fact, it's what we have to understand for us in Australia. I no doubt I don't speak for New Zealand, but imperialism is a hindrance for further advancement for our society here, for the people here in Australia. Yeah, sorry,
yeah, there's a little local step that feeds into that as well. So in New Zealand, we have what's called the Marsden Point Refinery. It's very, very big oil refinery because we have our own oil, not a hell of a lot of it. We're not Saudi Arabia, but we've got enough for us and to make a little bit of an export. And we have that refinery, and it was set up back in the day because it was cheaper and also it worked. But now they've decided actually it's cheaper to just get rid of the whole thing and just buy everything from the Yanks. And it's like, okay, but that is overlooking why it was set up in the first place, which was to give us some self-sufficiency in terms of, oh no, there's a disaster. So like with our Marsden Point refinery, if something goes wrong, like the Americans get involved in a war or the Aussies get involved in a war and we can't get fuel, okay, that sucks, but we can make some of our own. Maybe prices skyrocket a bit, but we can handle it. Now we can't. But the thing is, this is part and parcel of what the Americans have been doing for decades with other countries as well, which is we will sell you food cheaper than you can make it yourself, thus wiping out your local industry. And oh, look at that. Now that we've got you by the balls, you're going to do what we say or we'll starve all your people. Well, same kind of thing. Oh, I'm sure the Americans will be lovely, kind, friendly people and give us a good price. Right up until the point where our government steps out of line. Then suddenly, oh, look, there's all your fuel gone. And that's something that worries me locally.
Thank you, Comrade Ozzy. So we've been on here. It's going on close to 2 hours. There's a few points I wanted to make quickly and rapid fire. And I think we'll get into a round of conclusions. The first thing is I wanted to plug one of our last week's videos. For anybody who didn't see the presentation from the Oriental Despot, hopefully you can go back and watch that. The title is China imperialist? The answer is no, but the majority of that talk is talking about the development of imperialism, the understanding of imperialism. And in this material, it went over the two different theoretical concepts behind imperialism. And that is, number one, the exploitation. I'll correct myself. Number one really was in World War I, it was the fact that imperialist powers competing each other for dominance will cause war. So the reason the imperialist system causes war. And the second idea of that is oppressor nation and oppressed nations. And in reality, now that, we no longer really there is some competition among imperialist powers. Take Iraq for an example. Saddam was about to start trading oil in the euro, and then Saddam is taken out of power after 9/11, even though Saddam had nothing to do with 9/11. and so forth. But it really has become two different economic blocks. It's become the imperialist bloc and the socialist and anti-imperialist bloc. And that really is the global class struggle of the day. And because of this, China's investments and earlier, investments were one of the tools of imperialism to keep poor countries poor and exploited. But China's investments, because it's offering better deals, because it's helping to lift up those countries, is actually anti-imperialism. So finance capital is anti-imperialism. When it comes to China, I wanted to point out there, I think the other quick thing I wanted to raise with this was this idea of permanent revolution, which, if there were any Trotskyites reading this, they were probably getting angry and shaking their fist. Well, they probably didn't even listen because we're reading Stalin to begin with. But I really think this is an important idea. Back before Lenin understood the era of imperialism, permanent revolution made sense. The majority of these forces had, to have not a worldwide revolution, but they needed the majority of consensus so the other capitalist power wouldn't go against them. And then in this period of proletarian revolutions, it made sense to have, a base in one country, and then that country could help the other countries and be a global movement moving forward. And now that we're in this era of anti-imperialist bloc versus imperialist bloc, it's even more. It's almost like it advanced this idea further. Basically, any populist movement or nationalist movement in the global South is being pushed into socialism to be able to survive against the imperialist bloc, against the sanctions from the West. And I think that's interesting. So, any response to those 2 points from the comrades?
I think it's just a sign of increasing polarization, which is something that you get as the pressure rises. I mean, it was more or less inevitable. You see it in every system, whether it be politics or anything else, that as the pressure rises, people pick a side. And the funny thing is, I think the anti-imperialist side have the strength here, because not only do they have all the people, but they also have the understanding that who's the bad guy in the story. But they also, and this is a very Marxist kind of point, they also have all the stuff. All of the stuff that is made in the global South, everywhere from China to Vietnam to India. But all the stuff, the raw materials that supplies that, also comes from the global South. It ain't coming from Germany or France. And so when it all blows up, when people realize that all the power that the West has is just numbers on a balance sheet, they're going to look around and realize, hang on, all the iron that the world uses comes from our country. All the oil that the world uses comes from their country. All of the foods that we get comes from these guys' country. What's the West got? And once people wake up to that, that's when things are going to get really interesting. And things are going to get pretty bad in the West, because once everybody who's not in the West realizes that, it's like, wow, what do we got that we can sell? Nothing.
Very, very good point. I think as people in the, imperialist countries, I think one of our greatest demands should be reindustrialization. Because what does the U.S. have to offer the world? Right now, it's the petrodollar. It is, and China and other places are using other currencies. And even crypto, I don't want to get into crypto, which the Chinese have banned, is a way of, getting rid of governments altogether when it comes to currency. It's insane. So I think reindustrialization. So what do we have to offer the world? Nothing. So if we want our place in the global proletariat and we want to give back to the world, we need to industrialize and build up infrastructure and build up productive capacities as quickly as possible, as socialists and the imperialist countries. As we transition into anti-imperialist countries, as the monopoly capitalists fall. I have an interesting revolutionary theory based off a country song called "Pick Me Up on Your Way Down." Revolutionary theory. It is where it's kind of a sexist, backward song about a guy who loses a girl and the girl's out partying or whatever, and eventually she'll come back to him. But the idea is that the people will lose their love for the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie will no longer have the money, or the imperialists, the capitalists, the imperialist system will no longer be able to treat them as well as they have. And they're going to have to go back to the people. They're going to have to start thinking for themselves and mobilizing for themselves and align with the global South. Let's see. Any concluding statements before we sign off, guys?
Well, I think it's this has been, well, I don't think it is. This has been a fantastic discussion. There's been a lot to cover from today. We could be here for another hour and a half, 2 hours, talking even more about the discussion, what we've been taught from the study of theory today. And I highly recommend actually obtaining this book. This is the 1945 version. I was fortunate to land in my hands. Eventually we'll take that to a book restorer, fully fixed up. So some of the text you guys were reading were a little bit different from here, but still generally was the same. But I highly do recommend that, and I think it's really good to sort of have different insights from different comrades around the world as well, and their views on things moving forward, and even around here in our own country as well. Actually, just before I go, Luke mentioned, hasn't Australia done the same in regard to Australia's energy resources, particularly oil? A big definite yes, starting with a capital Y. It's obviously that's what's happened here. We're at the mercy of imperialism here as well. So I mean, we're no exception to the rule either. We could be if we actually manage to wrestle control of our own destiny, but unfortunately, no, we don't have that at the moment. So that's a lot of big organising in that area. But I think overall we've covered a lot of ground, like I've just stated tonight. There's just in that chapter alone was interesting. So I'm looking forward to further study and research. I just wish we had a couple more hours to go. But unfortunately, my girlfriend needs to jump on the computer too and do a tutoring for a young student.
Okay. Let's see, Comrade Ozzy, any concluding statements?
No, it was good, and I have more free time now. So if you guys ever need like a third wheel, just give us a yell. Also, I want to shout out a couple of people. Nick from Flame of Liberation said hello before, so hey. And also, I want to shout out my friend Escarina, who gave me this. Very thematically appropriate. So I just want to say, hi, Esk. I said I would call you out, so here I am. That's it. Hey! Well, mine's better.
I do like yours. It was a gift, so it's even better. If you were going to ask me to conclude, I would say... well, we did cover a whole lot. I was impressed how quickly we got through that chapter. We have some good dictators here, as you were saying earlier. I really enjoyed being out here and talking and getting amazing insights from and meeting new comrades. This has been really great. I hope to do it again soon.
All right. Thank you, everyone.